I'm really happy to be here presenting on some new developments in the Urban FIA program, as well as a bit of a refresher from the previous webinar in the series that was a few years ago when we were just getting Urban FIA started. So a lot has happened since then. And I'm also happy that we have Rebekah today, who's going to be delving into a more concrete example of how Urban FIA data is being used in a specific city and the online app developed in Texas. So as a little bit of context, I just wanted to explain, not everyone is familiar with the fact that the FIA program, the Forest Inventory and Analysis that is done throughout the United States, actually has three different components. There's the forest inventory and monitoring work, so that's the plot work that everyone is generally most familiar with, but there's also landowner surveys. There's the National Woodland Owner Survey, or NWOS, that goes out to private forest landowners. And there's also TPO, or Timber Product Output Surveys, or wood utilization surveys that are used to understand what happens when wood comes down out of our nation's forests. And so with Urban FIA, we're actually mirroring this three-pronged approach to really get a comprehensive understanding of urban natural resources. So I'm going to begin with a quick overview of the Urban FIA forest inventory work that's been going on for several years now, and then get into the other components. And just to take a step back, we have the core or rural FIA program. That's what we consider our nation's forest census, right? And so we measure trees and forest land throughout the United States, both public and private land, and you can see how that's distributed differently throughout the United States. But we have all of these census-defined urban areas that are getting missed, as well as other rural areas without forest land that meets the FIA definition of forest that were not being captured. So traditionally, FIA crews would go to areas that look like this, right? More like a traditional forest. But there's many trees that were falling through the gap because they were just individual trees or a smaller clump that didn't, as I said, didn't meet those definitions of FIA forest land. And I don't think I have to spend too much time on this point for this audience. You know, why are those trees important? Those individual trees and smaller clumps of trees we know provide still really significant ecosystem services, especially in urban areas where we have a high density of residents that interact with those green spaces and trees. But also I want to make the point that the FIA program is really looking nationwide to start to capture trees across all land uses, including agricultural lands as well. But Urban FIA has been a great example of this and is really sort of paving the way for us to capture all trees, not just forest land. Now, one question that we often get is, what is the difference between Urban FIA program and iTree? Folks in urban forestry are often really familiar with iTree, right? It's another urban forest inventory tool developed by the Forest Service. So the way that we explain it is that it's sort of a combination of both, right? We've merged the protocols from the core rural FIA program implemented on those rural forest lands with the protocols used in iTree, and specifically in iTree Eco. And iTree Eco is a tool that can be used for a municipality, but even for a smaller area. It's often used on college campuses, for example, so the community can go out and create an iTree Eco project to quantify the structure of their community's trees and the ecosystem services that are provided. So with Urban FIA, we've taken all the variables collected by the core FIA program, but we've also added in some from the iTree Eco protocol so that we can run those iTree Eco models and still generate the same values of ecosystem services and report those out. At the same time, we're bringing the rigor of the core FIA program. The data is collected by either Forest Service staff or contractors, but trained by the Forest Service, who still oversees QA/QC as well as compiling the data, which I'll get to a little bit later, and making it available online. So we're maintaining a lot of the integrity of the FIA program, but also bringing the relevance, I think, to urban communities provided by iTreeEco. And here is just an illustration of what a plot looks like. I'm not going to go through all of the variables that are collected, although I'm happy to answer any specific questions. But the plot does resemble an iTreeEco plot in the sense that it's one circular subplot, we call it, but we've got microplots where we're looking at saplings and regeneration. So that's an example of an aspect that was integrated from the core FIA program. Now I'm going to go through an example of the sample design using Baltimore, Maryland as an example, because this is often, I think, a question that comes up is how is this actually implemented on the ground? So this image I'm starting with is the state of Maryland, and this is the core FIA plot distribution throughout the state. And so here we've got one plot for every 6,000 acres. So on top of that, we're going to overlay the census-defined urban areas in blue, and this is the focus of our Urban FIA protocol. Around that, we draw the city's core-based statistical area, and this is an area made up of multiple counties. And so by combining the two, we zero in on the urban areas for Baltimore City's metropolitan area, essentially. Now, zooming in, you can see that there's actually only about 8 core FIA plots that lie within Baltimore City. And of course, that's not enough to estimate the tree population for the city. So within the city limits, we intensify to about 200 plots. And that may sound familiar for those of you that have worked with iTree. That's the number of plots that we consider to be appropriate to give us an estimate of the tree population for the city. So here you can see how we have sort of urban to rural coverage. In each one of these plot locations, both the red dots within the city and also those blue dots outside the city but still within those census-defined areas, we would be implementing the Urban FIA protocol. Now for the blue dots, we would also be collecting our core FIA data if the plot fell on forest land as defined by FIA. So there are occasions where we would actually collect both protocols side by side. And then outside the blue area is where the core rural FIA program picks up. And here's a map that shows our current status of implementation. We're in 35 cities throughout the United States and aiming for at least 100, including at least one city for each state. And you can see the year listed after each city is the year when data collection was first implemented. And that actually brings up a point that I should mention, that we are collecting data on an annualized panel system. So that is what happens with FIA data collection throughout the country. So for example, in Baltimore, again, we started data collection in 2014 and we're on a 7 panel. So that means that to collect data on those 200 plots will take us 7 years, and we've completed 5 years of that so far. At the end of the 7 years, we'll begin remeasuring those plots again. And so it's a model of continuous data collection. When Rebekah presents the tool using Texas data, we'll see that some locations have opted to add additional resources to intensify or accelerate data collection. So there is the opportunity or the option to collect all of the data in year 1 and then begin remeasurement in year 2. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this super whirlwind brief overview of the urban forest inventory work and move on. Oh, sorry, forgot one more topic. I just wanted to explain data flow and processing. So as all this data is coming in from all these cities, we are compiling it and running it through quality control and then sending it over to the iTree group to calculate those ecosystem services. And then it comes back and gets put into an FIA urban database, which ends up being put into a public-facing data mart. So this is another really important aspect of the Urban FIA program, is that our data is publicly available. From there, we of course generate standard Urban FIA reports that will come out periodically, but there's also the option to use tools such as eValidator, which is currently being developed for urban data, and that allows folks to create their own tables based on variables. And then of course we have the My Cities Trees app that Rebekah will be presenting, and other online tools in development to make the data more accessible, including storing maps. And here's an image of that public-facing data mart. You can see the Urban Data Mart button there, along with the other FIA data resources. So that, I think, wraps up my whirlwind tour of the forest inventory work. And I'm going to move on to talk about this National Landowner Survey component of Urban FIA. Now, as I mentioned, it's analogous to the NWOS, or National Woodland Owner Survey. And so we did begin with the NWOS instrument to develop this survey, but we also pulled in expertise and examples of other urban residential surveys to develop a tool that would be useful for municipalities. So the respondents that we're looking to target are private residential property owners within these cities, and they must own green space. So this is a really important point to keep in mind. It's not a survey of all of the residents of a city. It's a survey specifically of these private residential property owners. And it is the case that sometimes a property owner might own more than one property, but we're going to ask them to fill it out for a specific location. So as I mentioned, we pulled a team of experts and example surveys together to develop this tool, and then we went through some rounds of focus groups and pre-testing. We piloted the survey in Austin, Texas, and in several cities in Wisconsin, and Baltimore is now the first city where we're rolling it out in the final production mode, and the survey's out right now and should be wrapping up pretty soon. So we use an area-based sampling frame similar to the FIA plots where they're geographically distributed. You can see that illustrated here, and the size of the grid has to do with the number of responses we're aiming to get, as well as the size of the population and the amount of residential land. So we're aiming to have at least 100 responses for each city. And we do try to get responses from those residential landowners that happen to have an Urban FIA plot on their property. However, that won't get us to 100 responses. Often that will only be a few responses, so we have to target many, many more landowners. And we're expecting about a 20 to 30% response rate. So we send out to, many more than 100 landowners, of course. This is a mail-based survey. And I've mentioned that we sort of have a final version developed, and it will be uniform, rolled out nationally. But I should mention that there is the option to customize a page or two at the end of the survey. So we do have the ability for a local municipality or state to add in a couple questions that are of particular interest to them. So the timeline that we're hoping for is to roll the survey out about a year after forest inventory work is initiated in each location. Now, of course, we are still it's going to take us a while to get up and running, right, to get up to speed since we've just begun this, but this is our goal. We're also hoping to produce reports at about 5-year intervals, and the data will, of course, be made available online. And the survey is going to be implemented on a cycle, an annual cycle, just like plots, as I was explaining. So you can see here the cities that we've already done as pilots and what we have planned for 2019 and 2020. So hopefully some folks have already heard from us, or you may be hearing from us soon, and feel free to pipe up if you would like to learn more about how this is playing out in a specific location. So I don't have time to go through the entire survey, but I just wanted to give a flavor of the type of questions that we address with the landowner survey. We, of course, ask questions about the physical property and ownership, We ask about activities that occur on the property, and this is really some of the meat of the survey, because we want to understand how these residential landowners are managing their urban natural resources, right? Trees and otherwise. We care about all urban green space. Then we ask about sources of information and assistance in managing their property. And these are some questions that have proved to be really interesting, especially for those cities in Wisconsin that have piloted the survey. They've used the responses here to inform their outreach efforts. And asking who someone trusts to provide them with information has proven to be really insightful question, because it's not always the same person that is most accessible or that folks are going to. So how can we match them up with the trusted source? And how can a state or someone else connect with those trusted sources, right, to disseminate the best information and improve management of the urban forest resource? We also ask about programs that exist in a city, and so I think this is something that will be interesting to track changes over time as cities implement different conservation or tree planting initiatives to see how familiar folks are with these programs or how likely they are to participate in them. And finally, we ask questions about urban wood use. So this will give me a nice segue into the final component of the Urban FIA program. We want to know whether these landowners are familiar with this idea of urban wood use, if they have acquired any urban wood products, or if they're interested in purchasing these, and then specifically, you know, are they interested or is it important to them that urban wood from their own city is used for urban wood products, and what about from their own property in particular? Because this is sort of an angle that we have yet to really understand. We can talk to producers and processors of urban wood, as I'll get to in a minute, but we also have to understand how the consumers feel about if this is a priority for them. So finally, we have the urban wood flows component of the Urban FIA program, and this is analogous to that TPO, timber products output, or wood utilization surveys that we use in our rural areas. So when a tree is cut on an FIA plot, we can ask lots of questions about what happens to that tree, whether it's processed, how much residue is left behind, and where it's processed and what gets made. So we want to explore whether we can ask some of these same questions in urban areas. And we have surveys, mill surveys, that tell us, for example, again looking at Baltimore, where mills exist within different radius of the city. But it's not clear that that will really answer our questions about how urban wood is being used, who's using it, you know, where is it coming from, and where does it end up? Because in a city, it may not be the large traditional mills that are processing urban wood, right? It might be smaller artisans. There might be portable mills that get moved around, and so we're realizing that it's a bit more of a complex question. Here's an example of these mill surveys that go out in rural areas to these larger mills that have often been there, you know, probably for decades, right? It's a really different type of wood economy and flow of the wood resource than we find in urban areas. Now, if this is such a tricky question, I just want to pause and ask, you know, why is this worth delving into? Why do we want to address urban wood flows as part of Urban FIA? Well, we see that the urban tree and woody residues that come down are similar to harvest removals from national forests, and it seems that that will only expand over time as our urban and suburban areas expand, right? And so what we end up with is a lot of wood waste coming out of urban areas. And cities are often really interested in ways to reduce their waste, especially as they start sustainability programs and initiatives and you know, zero waste initiatives. They want a way to address this reduction of waste, but at the same time potentially create jobs, boost the economy, and also have an environmental impact by using this wood to a much higher value than currently happens. So in Baltimore City, we have something called the Baltimore Wood Project. And this is not to say that this entire program would become part of FIA, but we're sort of using it as our test kitchen. We're trying to understand urban wood flows in a city, what it takes to create a wood utilization plan and track urban wood, and then figure out what component of that we might be able to roll out nationwide. So as part of the Baltimore Wood Project, we know that it's important to quantify the urban wood resource, figure out how to salvage it from multiple waste streams, have a place to sort it, because only then can we figure out how to get it to the processors and producers, and then eventually out to consumers. And we frame all of this around waste to wealth, right? And we have both waste coming in from fresh cut wood. As you can see on the top, there's a picture of a tree coming down after a storm. With emerald ash borer, we've got a bunch of trees coming down in many cities. And in Baltimore, we also have deconstruction. And this may be more specific to older cities and shrinking cities, but we have a lot of old row homes with quite valuable lumber in them. And by using a deconstruction approach instead of a demolition approach, we're actually able to create jobs and create durable products that have real value for the economy. And this work in Baltimore is done by Humanum, which is a nonprofit organization. We've learned that having a sort yard is a really important component of creating a wood utilization plan and implementing it. And I should mention that we have an urban wood workbook coming out soon. It'll be a Forest Service publication, and it's sort of a how-to guide for a city to figure out how to create and implement wood utilization plan. And a big part of that is just tracking the resource, figuring out what you've got, what's possibly coming into the landfills now, and figuring out how to divert that to get diverted to a yard, a sort yard instead, and how to make that product available to processors and producers, right? So we have different levels of the urban wood flows program that we're investigating for Urban FIA. And I should mention, it's probably clear, but this is very much a work in progress, right? We're in development, and we welcome any comments and feedback, certainly, on this webinar. The first level could be examining the processors, so this would be more analogous to those mill surveys. We still want to understand what wood is coming in, what type and volume, and just focus, I guess, on that level as a starting point. But we might want to broaden our view out from there to look at the generators and then the producers. So where is that wood coming from before it gets to the processor, and then where is it going afterwards? And this might be another type of inventory and a survey. And then finally, there's the potential to look at the entire market analysis to understand what the whole market is worth in terms of revenue and avoided costs. Kind of value at every link in the chain, we'd say, right? And this is helping us get to an entire life cycle of the urban forest. So to tie it all together, hopefully I've convinced you that these three components are complementary. We have our forest inventory work that tells us what the urban forest resource is that's out there. And we're often, most closely in contact with public land owners, right, and public land managers. So we think it's important to also reach those private landowners. And in cities, private residential lands tend to hold a huge proportion of urban tree canopies. So we have our Urban Landowner Survey to understand how those folks are managing urban natural resources, and what are their sources of information and attitudes towards urban green space, and also what are their attitudes towards urban wood products. Are they open to the possibility of using urban wood, and is that a priority for them? And of course, in order to really get a sense of what an urban wood economy would look like, we need to, again, quantify the resource. So we need that urban forest inventory to complement any type of urban wood flow survey that we could implement. So with that, I'll wrap up. I have some additional contacts for each of these components, and at the end, I'll be happy to field any questions.